Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to City Beat. And this week, my guest is Councilman Tom Andersen.
Hi, Ken.
From Ward 2.
Hi, everybody out there in TV land.
So, we're going to discuss one of the big issues facing the city right now, and that's the new police facility bond, which is going to be on May 9th, I believe the election is?
I think it's the 16th.
The 16th,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So, there was a bond measure for the police facility in November. It failed. So what's different about this bond measure?
Well, this is very interesting, Ken, because on the bond measure that failed, it was $83 million. And I came to the council meeting when we were going to vote on the bond measure, and I had four motions. Motion one was to get rid of the communications center and keep it where it already is, the 9/11
Which
center.
we're leasing, and it's on
Yes.
like a 10-year lease or something?
Yes. I made that motion.
Right.
That would have cut $11 million from the
I remember
cost.
seeing that.
And I didn't even get a second. So if you don't get a second,
It goes nowhere.
you can't even discuss it. So then I made my second motion, which was to eliminate the 166 space parking garage, 2 stories, and instead dedicate parking at the Marion Parkade, which is less than 2 blocks away. That would have been $5–6 million. That got no second. So I didn't even make my other 2 motions. The main one would have been, instead of talking about growth at 2.4 officers per year, so you multiply that by 30, and that's how many officers you're going to be building for. I wanted to have it, or I was prepared to have it, to be 1.5 or 1.8. And when I'm getting no seconds on my other motions, I didn't even make those motions. So I voted for the bond measure, and the $83 million bond measure, because I believe we have a terrific, wonderful police department that is woefully laboring under horrible situations and inadequate space, and they need a new place. So, as you know, it lost 52 to 48. And after some discussion among council members and with community members and the police and staff, the police and the staff came back with a proposal for a $64 million police station bond, and it eliminated the communication center. It took the parking down from 166 to 100, and it estimated going out not 2.4 officers per year, but 1.0. So that brought it down to $64 million, which would have happened in the earlier one, but the council chose to go another way. So I actually made the motion to make it $61.8 million, just because that was the figure that was there, and I thought we could cut it down even more. And so that's what it is, and I enthusiastically support it. And you know, there were 2 things I think that caused it to be defeated, and this is just my own view, not any polls or anything, but one was the cost, obviously, $83 million. That's a lot of money. And the other was that there was nothing to do about earthquaking and seismic retrofitting the library, especially in City Hall as well. And so the 2 main factions that were against that were cost and not doing anything with the library and City Hall. So we took care of the cost by cutting over $20 million off of it, in other words, 25%.
By cutting down the size.
Cutting down the size.
And not having the 2-story parking garage.
Right, and there still is 2 stories, because I'm convinced, the police chief convinced me that on the 2nd story, you need places where you can get the officers' cars up so they can transfer equipment and all the stuff they have to carry. So there is still a 2nd story parking garage.
But it's greatly reduced.
Greatly reduced.
Okay.
And so the cost aspect of that was taken away. And then we also did not think it was appropriate just to say, well, we'll do something about the library in the future. So at the same time we passed unanimously the motion for $61.8 million, I also moved that we put seismic retrofitting bond measure, it's not defined, but it's going to be around $15 million to retrofit the entire library complex, and we passed that motion unanimously. And so on the November ballot will be a $15 million bond measure for retrofitting the library. So we're keeping faith with the citizens who clearly spoke to us and said, this is too much, you're not doing anything about the library, and so we've cut it way down and we've done something about the library. And the reason we can't do anything about City Hall now is because the police are going to, we can't retrofit it till the police move out. The
Right.
police won't move out till 2 or 3 years till the station is built. So it's,
You can't do anything because you have to have a different standard when
Right.
something is
Right.
got 24/7
yes.
occupancy.
Police station have a higher level of earthquake standards, and I don't know what it is, but
It's a much higher
yeah,
standard.
it has to be so that it will be standing after, you know, an earthquake of what, 7.2 or 7.0.
Well,
or
I think
something
they're
like
talking
that.
about 8 and 9.
Yeah, well, that's even better because
Yeah.
as we know, 8 and 9 is a whole lot more than 7.2 because
Yes.
it increases geometrically, not arithmetically.
So you're in favor of the new police facility bond,
Very much so.
and you want to see the library in November. It will be on the ballot,
It will be on the ballot in November.
and then some point down the road, say like 3 to 5 years, we'll probably see a bond measure for the City Hall.
And the other thing about the City Hall, before we get to that, I want to say that I just discovered today that the ballot measure is out and it lists the city councilors who support it, and somehow my name isn't on there. So I want to tell everybody that I support it, and I signed the paperwork, so I don't know what happened.
Okay.
But getting back to the City Hall complex, one of the things we learned when we were looking at the designs of the police station is the least effective design-wise building is a U-shaped building, because you're on one corner of the U. To get to the opposite side, you got to go all the way around, and that's what the City Hall is. It's a U-shaped building. In addition, it's extremely energy inefficient. There are all sorts of issues. Excuse me. So it may well be that we, in that 3 to 5 years before the bond, we will look at it and say maybe it's better to add somehow to it, to you know, close out the U, or to put an inner sort of U to make it just more efficient, more design efficient as well as more energy efficient. And of course it would be earthquake seismic proof, not retrofitted, because it could potentially be a new building. So that's stuff we'll look at.
Yeah, because a U-shape, as far as energy efficiency, is the worst.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're better off, actually the best thing is a square.
Yes. Yeah, and so it may be that all we need to do is square it off, you know, the U, and that would be extremely helpful. That's also helpful for traffic flow and everything else.
Right. And plus there's been a lot of leakage.
Oh yeah, you know, the name for that architecture style is brutalism, and that fits. But I discovered the other day when I was talking to somebody about that the name does not come from the brutal looking style, but it's somehow from the French word for concrete, which is most brutalism buildings are built with concrete. So that's how the name comes from.
That's
Brutale.
interesting.
I mean, I don't know. That one sounds more Italian than French to me.
Well, the French are always stealing from the Italians. But
Yes,
anyway,
yes.
So you're in favor of it, and you're going to back it?
Yeah.
Okay. And having been in the police academy, I can testify to the fact that, yes, we do need a new police facility. It's way too small.
Yeah.
There were a couple of issues that came up in the last city council meeting. One was the Uber, Lyft, the ride sharing, and also there was the Airbnb. So would you like to take one of those on first?
Sure.
We're going to go to both of them. But
Let me first say this all with the preference. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm the old man who's saying, you kids get off my lawn. Both of these, ride sharing, home sharing, are, you know, new concepts. And sometimes, you know, I might feel like I'm a horse and buggy advocate saying, no, that Model T will never work. I understand that this is the way of the future, and we need to discuss it. But it's very bizarre, Ken, because almost daily there's something new about Uber and its abysmal business practices. I saw something today someplace on one of the online news agencies that there's some other crisis that has come up again with Uber. They've had problems with dealing with their drivers in terms of, are they independent contractors? Are they employees? And of course, Uber wants them to be independent contractors because then they don't have to pay certain benefits for them. They've had problems with sexual discrimination within Uber, the Uber organization. They've had problems with some issues with, let's just say, lack of safety with the drivers and various crimes that have been committed. So, they're kind of their own worst enemy. And there's also the issue of surge pricing, which means when you need a ride more desperately, you're going to have to pay more for it, is what it really boils down to. And there's a potential issue of, are they really, with all the big money they have backing it, is their goal, unstated goal, is to drive out the competition, and when there's no competition, they can raise their rates. Those are
you mean drive out taxis?
Yes. Yeah.
And also public transportation?
Well, that's the last thing I want to discuss in that, because I think it's a very, very serious danger to equate Uber with public transportation, Uber and Lyft and the other companies with public transportation and mass transportation. And that's totally fallacious for a number of reasons. The main one being that the people who most rely on mass transit are not going to be able to afford Uber or cabs, or oftentimes their own cars. So we do not want to fall into the trap of feeling like, well, we've now got Uber and Lyft and all these other new ride-sharing things, so we don't have to worry about public transportation. And the lack of mass transportation on evenings after 9 and on weekends is I don't know, I don't want to say it's almost criminal, but it's an extremely atrocious thing, and that's not at all good for all aspects of Salem society, including business, both retail business, commercial business, and manufacturing and industry business. We need to have full service mass transit here, and we don't want to use Uber as an excuse not to continue to moving toward getting 7 days a week mass transit.
Yeah, because I think there was somebody that testified, and they were talking about it cost them $12.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's a lot more expensive than public transportation.
I don't know what the bus pass system is right now, but I suspect it's not much more than $12 for a month. Maybe.
I think it's about 40.
Yeah. Well, that's 40 for every single day,
yes,
except for the weekends.
Well, yes, and that is a big problem for people getting to and from to work or school.
It's an extreme problem.
And like one of the things that I found, I was interested in taking a class at Chemeketa that started at 7, so I could take the bus, but it was going to take me basically an hour to get there.
Yeah, and then you couldn't get one home.
The last bus to leave Chemeketa Community College left before the class was over.
Yeah.
So I'd have to leave class early to catch it.
It's totally inefficient, and as you know, I think it was a year ago November, maybe it was just it was a year ago November, there was a payroll tax,
right,
which I was extremely in favor of. I wrote op-eds, I spoke to groups about it, based on my experience as for parts of 2 terms, I was on the Lane Transit District Board in Eugene, where there was a payroll tax 3+ times what the payroll tax here was, which ended up, if you had $1 million payroll, you would be paying $2,100 in payroll tax. So if you can't come up with $2,000 on $1 million payroll, you've got some other problem with your business, not the tax. And unfortunately, that was opposed by much of the business community, and it was defeated. And so it seems kind of disingenuous to say, well, now that we have Uber, we'll have all our transportation solved. And we shouldn't do that, and I'm going to see what I can do to make sure that we don't do that. Having said all that, I'm not necessarily against the Uber on the things that we talked about before. The interesting thing to me is when we first started this, we had the first go around of Uber potential legislation, a year and a half ago maybe. And let's say here's the standards that the taxis are held to, standards of police background checks, of insurance, of availability, of safety issues. All that is, say, this high, and Uber wanted to come in like this. So the first, with lesser standards. So the first ordinance basically brought Uber up to the taxi company standards.
Is that when they left town?
Yes. No surprise there. And so the new ordinance now takes the taxis down to Uber's level. So that may be good for the taxis, maybe not. So we're down here. One of the things that we've had a lot of concerns and talk about is the background checks. For taxi companies right now, the police do it. And under the new proposed city code, the companies would do it, which would include the taxis companies coming down here. And there are all sorts of safeguards into it, and has to be, a recognized, well-known group that does the background checks. And there are many of these around in business, and it's got to be provided, and various things have to happen. So, I suspect I'll eventually support it, but it's kind of like I'm being dragged and kicked from my buggy into the Model T Ford.
But I know a lot of people that are very concerned about the background check for drivers.
Yeah.
They will not get on an Uber because they just don't feel comfortable with that situation.
That is one of the myriad of problems we were talking about earlier in our conversation, that there's all sorts of things that have happened. Now, I'm sure there are probably things that happen with taxi drivers.
Yeah.
But the prime concern that I would say we have in any sort of public transportation, not mass transportation, not the bus system, but for hire transportation, is serving the whole public and the safety of the public. And those are things that we need to ensure are there, no matter what the transportation for hire system we have. I'm sure that the new ordinance will do that, but it's going to take some education, and there's going to be a little bit of a learning process for that.
And the other portion was Airbnb.
Well, that's a very interesting one to me too, because again, house sharing, ride sharing, it's really, you're renting out your rooms or you're renting out your car. I mean, it's a misnomer to call it that, I think. As far as I know, ride sharing is hitchhiking, and house sharing might be couch surfing. But the potential problem with Airbnb type stuff is a non-resident owner. And if there's a non-resident owner, you can see the potential for all sorts of problems in single-family neighborhoods, or even in low-density neighborhoods. There's just something to be said for having the owner or a long-term renter in a house. And our ordinance has dealt with that. In fact, there are basically two types of Airbnb, let's just call them that, just like saying Xerox or Kleenex, two types of Airbnb. One is kind of the equivalent of the old bed and breakfast. And the bed and breakfast in certain higher density residential zones and in certain non-residential zones is just a permitted use, meaning you can do it. And you don't have to have, you have to have somebody there, but it doesn't have to be the owner-operator. And in the residential uses, you need to get a conditional use permit for that. And the second type of one is I can't remember the name, but it's the equivalent of the Airbnb, the new type. And in that one, it's a permitted use, but only if the owner is present or the long-term renter is present. And I think that's a good thing. And I know that some of the neighborhood groups, particularly SCAN, of which I'm a member and which I've been the president and held other officers for a number of years, their big concern is we want this to be owner-occupied or long-term lease occupied. I had an interesting call, Ken, from somebody, called me in my capacity as a counselor and said, I want to talk to you about Airbnbs. We own 2 houses in your ward and we're renting them out as Airbnbs. And it was kind of unfortunate for them because I am a trial lawyer and I was just in the middle of a big trial having a day off. So I'm in a cross-examination, aggressive lawyer mode. And I say, oh, do you live in those houses? Well, no, we don't. Well, where do you live? We live out so-and-so. Well, what would you feel like if neighbors on both sides of you didn't live in those houses and sold them out and there were people coming in, coming out, strangers day in and day out? And they hadn't thought about it in that terms before. And I said, well, why don't you rent out the 2 homes you own long-term leases to some stable renters there? And they said, well, that's not going to give us the same money. And I said, okay, but that's also not going to give the neighborhood the same stability. And I apologized to them for being aggressive. And I said, I'm happy to meet with you some other time to talk about this, and I'll be a little calmed down and we can have a rational discussion. They've never called me back, so maybe I scared them off. But that's part of the problem. And this happens in all cities, people who buy homes just for the purpose of basically running their own mini hotel in it. And that really has an effect upon the available housing for people who live here and really need the housing. And as you know, Ken, that's affordable housing and housing for the homeless. That's an issue that faces Salem, just like it faces every other city in America. So if you end up having someone who, in an Airbnb type situation, who lives there, you're not taking a home away from somebody else who wants to live in Salem.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've had experience with unofficial fraternity homes on my block. And that is, and like, some years it's fine, other years it's hell.
Yes.
And I would imagine the Airbnb is kind of similar. It depends on who comes in.
Exactly right.
It might be fine. Other times it might be hell.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And the thing is, you're not going to know until
the
people show up. And then it's too late. It's too late.
So I guess there's going to be kind of some restrictions put on. And the one that you want is owner-occupied.
And not only that, it's in the ordinance. It's in the proposed ordinance now. And we had what's called the first reading. Excuse me. And there are going to be public hearings on both the transportation for hire and the homes for hire. One, I think, is April 24th, the next meeting. And I think it's the transportation for hire. And the Airbnb sort of issues will be heard at a later time, and so there will be a chance for everybody in the public come on down to the council and talk to them. So, and I was glad that you,
directed the city manager to make sure that staff talked to Yellow Cab at this, because I was very shocked that they hadn't already been informed about the meeting.
Well, that's kind of interesting because that's what they said, and I got an email afterwards. And I had asked staff to meet with them beforehand. And I got an email from the city attorney who said that's what the person said is not completely true because my staff sent them the ordinance and my staff called them up and we had a conversation with them. Now, perhaps the conversation was not, I think the man's name is Mr. Wakefield, who owns one of the cab companies. Perhaps it's not with him. His daughter shows up a lot and testifies. Perhaps it was with her, perhaps it was someone else. But the city did take some effort.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I am too. And I was glad that the attorney told me that.
So, Ward 2, could you describe that and what are some of the main issues concerning Ward 2?
Well, Ward 2 physically, basically, with a few exceptions, is Commercial Street down to Vista and then going east to the freeway, and then north it goes to Pringle Creek that runs right out in front of the studios here, and then it jogs over and takes in the parts of State Street and the north campus of the hospital, then to the freeway. So it's a ward where there's a fairly wide range of income levels and housing levels there, and there are 6 different neighborhood groups in the ward, or parts of them. I have more neighborhood groups than any other councilor. And you know, the main ones are Nesca, Cessna, Scan, and then Simca, and Morningside, and NEN. All of you know what those acronyms mean, but they're all the core kind of city neighborhoods and going out to the airport. And Scan is a very, very active neighborhood, as is Nesca, as is Cessna. And those are all the close-in neighborhoods. And maintaining the quality of their neighborhoods is very important to them. And there's a number of pressures on all those neighborhoods because they're close in. The city expanding, people coming in, the arterial streets, Commercial, Liberty, State Center,
Street.
Market, all those, the traffic and the other pressure on them. So, you know, the neighborhoods aren't interested in having another pressure point, which would be, you know, non-owner occupied short-term rentals, as opposed to non-owner occupied long-term rentals, which certainly a much needed part of the housing structure in the city of Salem. But Airbnb it's a issue that all the neighborhoods I represent feel pretty strongly about.
Yeah, one of the things that historically has happened to those close-in neighborhoods, as cities expand outward,
Yeah.
the inner ring starts to deteriorate because they're
Yes.
paying a lot of taxes, but it's going to the outer portion, and then the maintenance isn't kept up. And this has been kind of an issue for some of those areas that you're talking about in your ward.
Much so, very much so. And the people in those close-in wards, they're aware of that potential, and they're very vigilant and zealous in defending it. And I say good on them. That's very important. You know, you've just mentioned a couple other things that about the developing outers and everything else. We could have 3 or 4 conversations on that, and I'd be happy to come back.
Well, I think we need to have that conversation because I think that's something that impacts the budget of the city and makes it more and more difficult for the city to maintain a certain amount of level as they expand out.
Well, I just have 3 words for you: system development charges. And I can talk about that because I'm the head of a committee now to deal with those.
Well, Tom, I think we should have a discussion that just addresses that issue because
I'm
I
happy
think
to do that.
it's one that isn't discussed very often and people don't understand what's going on.
Are we out of time?
We are.
Okay, I'm sorry then.
Well, no.
I just quickly, I want to say I'm so glad we made Salem an inclusive city, and I sponsored that resolution and it got unanimous vote, and that's terrific.
Well, thank you, Tom, for coming tonight.
Yep.
And this has been City Beat. See you next time.